At 4:30, the drawing-room at Rutledge House proposed its civilized comforts as if nothing in the world could ever ruffle them. A pale spring light touched the gilt on the mirror and laid a tepid sheen upon a watercolor of Venice. The fireplace was declaratively ornamental. One came to this room to forget weather, taxes, and other people's tempers. Lady Honoria Varden, in a gown the color of old lilac, presided at the tea-table with her practiced serenity. She rang a small jade bell for Pritchard, the butler, and its note fell like a bead into velvet. A silver caddy stood open, a spoon nested in its dark heart. The porcelain was Lowestoft, the teaspoons Georgian, the ritual entirely her own. She had the way of making cups for each guest as if she were restringing a necklace, one pearl at a time. Sir Felix Varden, retired from the bench but still judicial in posture, moved from group to group with an absent courtesy that was almost affectionate. His son, Miles, elegant, pale, and politely restless, stared at the portrait over the piano as if it had interrupted him. The portrait was by Ludo Fane, who lounged by the window so in a frayed beauty that looked deliberate. Miss Verity Lane, whose name on a program meant filled stalls, had tucked herself into a corner where light could decorate her cheekbones. General Bracknell handled a cup as if it might salute. Dr. Peregrine Swan, whose scholarship had made a whispering noise at the university, stood too carefully near the tea-table, like a man conscious of spillage. "You'll have lemon, General," Lady Honoria said. "You can't endure cream." "I endure many things, my lady," the General replied, "most of them less agreeable." "Milk, dear Sir Felix?" she added, already knowing. Her hand paused, with its thin gold ring on the cream jug. To Miles, she gave tea without comment, and the silence had a small temperature. Ludo Fane drifted to the portrait. "I am almost content," he murmured. "The mouth is stubborn. It refuses me." "It refuses a certain sentimentality," Verity Lane observed, "which is surely a blessing." Sir Felix, who disliked the sound of praise when it was too near him, interposed, "We will not set art to quarreling with itself. Ludo, you've done wonders with stubbornness. It looks nearly honest." Lady Honoria's smile flickered. She touched the brooch at her shoulder, an old-cut citrine set in a web of gold. Honesty will never quite agree to be painted. It thinks the mirror sufficient. Pritchard poured hot water into the pot, as if into a promise, and withdrew soundlessly. He had the sort of respectful presence that counted as furniture until one needed the furniture to speak. Lady Honoria replaced the jade bell on its lacquer stand with a faint click. Her tea was strong, Verity's palest. The pattern was exact. Even Miles's saucer was placed with its floral cartouche precisely north. "Your 5 o'clock is a scandal of accuracy," Verity said. "It makes one feel late to one's self." "Punctuality is a poor virtue," Dr. Swan ventured, "but it is incontestably a virtue." "It is a habit," Lady Honoria said. "One clings to those one can defend." Miles's laugh was almost kind. The indefensible ones are much more interesting. Between them lay the portrait. It showed a woman not quite as beautiful as Lady Honoria, but somehow larger. The painter had taken her poise and made architecture of it. Only the mouth kept a private reservation. "We shall hang it in the morning room," Sir Felix said. "The northern light is kind to complexion, even when it is only paint." "Let us hope the sitter is equally kind," Ludo said lightly. "Kindness," Lady Honoria replied, "is often a matter of lighting." They drank their tea and spoke of nothing. Rehearsals, committees, a charity dance in aid of indigent actors. The door opened twice, and Pritchard brought in a plate of seed cake that nobody ate, and a folded note that Lady Honoria laid beside the jade bell without reading. The note's handwriting, assertive and angular, allowed itself to be ignored. General Bracknell examined the mantel clock. "Your French fellow is slow." He keeps his own counsel, Sir Felix said, as do we all. The clock, obstinate, slid to 5 precisely. Lady Honoria's hand tightened very slightly on the bell. It was enough for Pritchard, who came at once, though she had not rung. "Another pot, my lady?" "Not yet," she said. "Perhaps later. We shall have a little air." The room let out a breath that no one had noticed it was holding. In the quiet, the seed cake looked as if it had been waiting a long time for a hand that did not come. Outside, a taxicab sighed. Inside, the portrait watched with a patience that could only be paint. The ritual of tea concluded itself with the faintest tremor of porcelain and a collective sigh that was not quite contentment. Dusk pressed its cheek against the tall windows, and the room, softened by shadow, seemed to invite confidences. Lady Constance, with a little motion of her hand that dismissed gratitude and obligation in one gesture, rose from the tea-table. "If you will forgive me a moment," she said. "Pritchard, the blue envelope. Mr. Whitmore has mislaid the Foreign Office letter. In the morning room, I think." She passed, unhurried, through the double doors, the whisper of her silk merging into the general hush. Conversation resumed in softer keys. Miss Penelope returned to her gambit about the portrait, daring Thornfield with a brightness that threatened a fracture. General Finch consulted his pocket watch, found it more reliable than the French clock, and looked gratified in a way that suggested principle had been vindicated. Dr. Hartwell spoke to Mrs. Ashworth with concerned gentleness about the hazards of damp staircases and the virtues of sensible shoes, and Mrs. Ashworth allowed the counsel to pass like rain over a good umbrella. 10 minutes, perhaps 15, collected themselves without fuss. The seed cake continued its solitary perfection, uncut. Whitmore, with an apologetic cough that deferred to everything and everyone, approached the tea-table. "Lady Constance did say the blue envelope, ma'am," he ventured to Mrs. Ashworth, who by seniority and temperament seemed momentarily to preside. "I hesitate to. Pritchard is not in the hall." Penelope laughed too brightly. "She is always rescuing our papers. She will appear with it, triumphant, and scold us for carelessness." No one contradicted her, and yet something like a draught coursed, as if a door had been left ajar in the mind. "At last, because precision is a form of courage," General Finch said. "Perhaps I should fetch her." Whitmore shook his head. "Allow me, Sir Alistair." He moved with discreet speed. A minute later he returned, careful to bring no expression with him. "She is not in the morning room." The sentence, placed quietly in the center of the carpet, altered the shape of the afternoon. Pritchard materialized with the unobtrusive authority of his kind. "Shall I look upstairs, madam?" Mrs. Ashworth inclined her head. "Do so, Pritchard, and no alarm." They did not call, they did not clatter. Doors opened and closed with correct discretion. Thornfield stood by the hearth, hands folded as if posing for one of his own portraits, while Penelope worried the fringe of a cushion into ruin. Dr. Hartwell's gaze had gone inward, as if rummaging among diagnoses that belonged to other rooms, other years. It was Pritchard who found her. He reappeared in the doorway, and though nothing in his posture had altered, the room felt the change. "In the morning room, madam," he said to Mrs. Ashworth, as if correcting a minor confusion. "By the escritoire." They went, not in a rush, but in an orderly drift, like parishioners receiving communion. The morning room accepted them with pale walls and the faint perfume of orris from the writing paper. Lady Constance was seated at the little desk, her head slightly bowed, one hand resting beside a small porcelain cup she had not taken from the tea-tray. The blue envelope lay upon the blotter, a mere object among objects. Dr. Hartwell reached her first, with a physician's economy. He touched the wrist, the throat, the coolness of the air itself. "She is gone," he said, and his voice, though quiet, found every corner. No one gasped. Penelope's hand found the back of a chair and clung to it. General Finch, under fire again after a long armistice, stiffened into his training. Whitmore stared at the blue envelope as if it had developed a conscience. Pritchard, immaculate, attended. There was no disorder. The clock in the hall, disdainful of the French rival, struck the half-hour. Outside, a cab rattled past. Within, a silence gathered, proper and implacable, like a curtain coming down. Dusk pressed softly against the high windows of Meridian House when the bell announced the police. Inspector Roderick Alleyn entered with that courteous self-effacement which contrives to notice everything by seeming to notice nothing. Behind him, stolid and considerate, came Inspector Fox. The butler, Pritchard, who understood that true efficiency is soundless, took hats and coats without needing to be told. In the drawing-room, the company rose with the reflexes of good breeding. Alleyn's glance, light as a moth's wing, traveled the room. The silver tea service remained in its precise arrangement. The seed cake had kept its virginal perfection. The French mantel clock, a dandy among clocks, lagged a minute and a half behind Alleyn's wristwatch. The fire, carefully husbanded, made a discreet pattern of light upon the orbison and upon faces that had been trained all their lives to betray nothing they did not choose. Mrs. Ashworth sat as if carved from some pale, durable material. Only her eyes acknowledged the intrusion. General Finch stood squarely by the hearth, the polish on his shoes, an argument for order in a disordered world. Dr. Hartwell, unflurried, had placed himself without ceremony where he could be useful. Miss Penelope Fairweather's handkerchief was crushed into a small white tragedy in her palm. Mr. Whitmore looked like a ledger held very straight. Marcus Thornfield, his long fingers ink-shadowed or perhaps paint-stained at the tips, seemed retracted into himself, a spectator of his own life. Pritchard remained present in the way superior butlers do, an absence one is aware of. "I am very sorry," Alleyn said, and the simplicity of it was balm. Dr. Hartwell. "Life is extinct," the doctor replied. "No sign of struggle. She appears to have—" He settled on the neutral term with care. Ceased. "Quite." Alleyn's eyes moved once more over the tea things. He did not touch them. He did not ask questions. "If you will forgive me a moment's look at the morning room. Fox?" They went along a corridor where the carpets muffled speculation. The morning room received the last of the day in a level band that lay across the escritoire and made a stage of it. Lady Constance sat composed at the little desk, her head against the high back, her hands folded as if to keep her life in order to the last. On the leather blotter lay a blue official envelope, slit neatly. Its contents, thin sheets with a pale crest, had fanned outward. The pen was uncapped. A single drop of ink had spread to a disciplined circle against the blotter's grain. Alleyn stood, took in the arrangement, and, because he was Alleyn, took in what was not there. No cup, no tea-cake plate. A small glass stood by the paper knife, clouded faintly at the rim. A pale chrysanthemum petal, bruised, lay by a chair leg on the carpet, as if it had remembered an earlier, trivial adjustment and declined to stay put. The chair opposite the desk was set a fraction wide of the others, the kind of displacement only habit would register. The window latch was secure. The air carried no betraying scent beyond beeswax and paper. "Touch," Fox murmured. "Nothing," said Alleyn. "Doctor, you felt for a pulse only?" "I did. I moved nothing further." "Good." Alleyn's voice remained courteous. "Pritchard, the room will be kept as it is. The telephone, pray let it be used only at my request." "Very good, sir." They returned along the corridor. Alleyn paused at the drawing-room threshold to look as one looks at a painting one intends to remember, for tone, for balance, for the single stroke that upsets both. Whitmore had not altered his angle to the window by so much as a degree. Miss Penelope had smoothed the handkerchief into docility. Marcus Thornfield watched the carpet. One cuff bore a maize-colored stain as delicate as pollen. General Finch had not, after all, consulted his watch again. Mrs. Ashworth's cane tip rested on the border of the rug. A faint trace of dried mud showed where it met the silk. "If you please," Alleyn said, and the murmur quieted of its own accord. "I must ask you to remain. Presently I shall speak with each of you in turn." He took his place not as an inquisitor, but as one guest unexpectedly obliged to host. The room, for the moment, would speak more reliably than its occupants. He allowed its sentences to compose themselves in silence, and the silence lengthened with the gentle inevitability of evening. Alleyn began in the manner of a courteous guest assuming a minor responsibility. He drew a small table lamp nearer, so that its circle of light fell pleasantly and did not interrogate. Dr. Hartwell submitted himself first with professional composure, folding his hands and fixing his mild eyes on the fire rather than the policeman. "You reached her ladyship within—" "How long?" Alleyn asked. 20 minutes, perhaps a little more," Hartwell replied. "I did not consult a watch. There was no distress, Inspector, if anything a serenity inconsistent with struggle." "Had you any warning of such an event?" Hartwell hesitated with the scruple of a man whose confidences are habit. "A slight arrhythmia. I advised moderation, rest, and an avoidance of stimulants." She laughed, very gently, and promised obedience as soon as the season permitted. "You noticed anything unusual in the morning room?" "A water glass by the blotter. I was grateful for it, though it did not signify. She was beyond help." Alleyn nodded, letting the silence absorb the rest. He did not ask why the glass had troubled him. It would keep. Mr. Whitmore presented himself next with ledger-like neatness. "Her ladyship spoke of the blue envelope at tea," he said before being asked, as if reciting minutes. "Sir Reginald's office. Seating, precedence, the order of speeches. Nothing contentious." "You would have known if anything out of the ordinary had arrived." "I opened the routine post. Lady Constance reserved private letters. The Foreign Office material is generally soporific." A fractional pause. "I did not expect her to be long. She disliked leaving her guests." "Yet you did not go after her," Alleyn said very gently. Whitmore's mouth tightened. "It is not the place of a secretary to anticipate a mistress's wishes in her own house. Pritchard attends to such matters. Besides, Miss Penelope required a note for the portrait sitting." "Did she?" Alleyn's tone made it an indifferent remark. Whitmore flushed, not at the question, but at having offered more than was necessary. The general stood as if giving evidence at a court-martial. "Lady Constance rose at 16 minutes past 5. I remember because your man Pritchard removed the tray at 21 past. The mantel clock is slow by 2 minutes. I checked." "Helpful," Alleyn murmured. "You saw nothing else?" "A certain restlessness in the young. It is not my business to diagnose society." "Nevertheless," said Alleyn, and waited. Thornfield and the girl, Miss Penelope, were engaged in a discussion about truth in art. He takes it seriously. I prefer cavalry. Marcus Thornfield met Alleyn's questions with grave courtesy and an artist's self-containment. "If I seemed abstracted, Inspector, it is because death throws shadows oddly across a room. One is tempted to record them." "You had paint on your fingers," Alleyn observed. "Verdigris and bone black," Thornfield said, spreading his hands. "I had been glazing a portrait in my studio after luncheon. Artists carry traces of their occupation like priests of incense." "You spoke with Lady Constance before tea." "Briefly. She sat for me yesterday. I admired her control. It is not common." Miss Penelope came last among the principals, though she contrived to arrive as if by accident, the handkerchief still serviceable. "If this is quite necessary," she said, then caught herself and added, "Forgive me. Tell me what you did while your aunt was away," Alleyn said. "I talked nonsense," she said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I always do when I'm frightened." "You were frightened before she left?" "Not precisely. Only, There was a telephone call earlier. Wrong number. A man's voice. He asked for the lady of the house and then rang off when I offered to help. She glanced up, instantly penitent. It is foolish to mention it. Not at all, Alleyn said. Which instrument? The small table in the morning room. And after tea, he asked gently, did you eat the seed cake? She looked at the silver stand with something like dislike. No one ever eats it. It is one of Aunt Constance's courtesies. When the principals had been released with thanks, Alleyn let the room breathe. He felt Fox's quiet presence beyond the door, steady as a metronome, and heard the discreet tread of Pritchard somewhere along the corridor. The formalities were accomplished, and the evasions had been neatly done. It was time, he thought, to ask the house about its mistress through those who moved within it as a routine and who knew the rituals that others merely observed. Alleyn asked that the staff be seen in their own province. Pritchard received the suggestion with a flicker of relief and conducted him and Fox to the still room, where the odor of tea and lemon peel lingered. Copper pans glowed on the dresser. A white cloth lay drawn across the table. Pritchard stood, not quite at attention. Her ladyship kept a very regular house, sir. I flatter myself we did not put a foot wrong. I am sure of it, Alleyn said. Were any of the small regularities a hair's breadth out? Pritchard's gaze shifted toward the shelf where a cut-glass tumbler had lately stood. Half an hour before tea, her ladyship asked for fresh water to be set in the morning room. I placed it on the escritoire. She takes water after tea sometimes, not before. With anything in it? Nothing, sir. He considered. Her drops, digitalis, are for bedtime and kept in her room. Alleyn let this rest. Anything further? There was the matter of the chrysanthemums, Pritchard said. At 4, Mr. Whitmore requested a new bowl for the drawing room. Her ladyship adjusted them as she left us. I took no bud vase to the morning room. You answered the telephone? The hall instrument, sir. At 3:45, a gentleman asked for the lady of the house. Miss Penelope was on the extension and took it. Mrs. Bracy, the housekeeper, hovered at the door and was invited to sit. Lady Constance was quiet this morning, she said. She sent me a line to have the small dispatch box returned to the morning room. Usually it stays in my safe. She would see to some papers herself. She gave you the key. Mr. Whitmore brought it from her chain, Mrs. Bracy replied after a fractional pause. A little Yale on blue silk. He returned it within the hour. Fox examined a copper kettle with rustic unconcern. The parlour-maid, Elsie, came in with reddened eyelids. We had the seed cake as usual, sir, she said. Only her ladyship didn't have none. I cut the first slice and set it ready. It's there now, under the cover. The knife? In the salver, sir. I wiped it after cutting. She swallowed. Mr. Whitmore said not to clutter. Mrs. Bunce, from her range, contributed without turning. She never ate enough. Drops and decorum. The housekeeper hushed her. Last came Jarvis, the chauffeur, faintly smelling of petrol. Nothing to tell, sir. I was at the Mews. Only Mr. Thornfield used the side door from the garden at 5:10. That isn't his habit. Alleyn thanked them and let them go. The room settled back into order as if nothing had been disturbed. Yet the household's knowledge lay folded like linen, each piece labeled but not displayed. A glass had been set too early. A key had traveled. A slice had been cut for the mistress of the house and not taken. Flowers had migrated by someone's will and left a single petal to mark their passage. He did not write it down. The house itself was speaking, and he preferred to listen. Alleyn returned to the morning room with Fox in his sober wake and stood for a time without movement, letting the small appointment speak. It was a room built for quiet industry. The escritoire set square to the window, the blotter green and smooth as moss, the standish, its nibs aligned. Death had entered here with excessive politeness and found everything in order, or nearly so. You notice the water glass, Fox murmured. I notice its unfamiliarity, Alleyn said. Lady Constance, it seems, preferred tea before all else. He lifted the glass without touching the rim, holding it to the lamplight. The faint clouding persisted, not the fog of imperfect polishing, but something subtler, as if a film had briefly trembled and then resigned itself to glass. He set it down and looked instead at the blue Foreign Office envelope, its contents fanned with official neatness. The flap, he observed, had been opened with a paper knife. No tearing, no impatience. Yet the knife itself lay oddly, not quite where a tidy hand would have restored it. He bent to the carpet. There, on the precise wool, lay the chrysanthemum petal he had noticed before, pale as a shed eyelid. He turned it on his finger, the slightest dust of pollen gilding his skin. "Pritchard," he said, when the butler presented himself with his customary gravity, "have you chrysanthemums in here?" "No, sir. Roses in the morning room for the scent, chrysanthemums for the drawing room for their staying power. Mrs. Hartwell objects to strong perfume about the tea table." "So this petal is an immigrant," Alleyn said mildly, and watched the notion settle. "Her ladyship did adjust the drawing-room arrangement, sir, when she rose," Pritchard offered, with the delicate suggestion of a man supplying a reasonable alternative. "A petal may have clung to her sleeve." "Yes," Alleyn said, "it may." He glanced at the sleeve of the afternoon dress, folded now with bleak propriety. There was, if one looked for it, a faint dusting at the cuff where a restless hand might have brushed a bloom. It proved little, save that small deviations often arrive on the most innocent of vehicles. He turned to the escritoire. The reading glasses lay folded to one side. "Does Lady Constance read with these, Pritchard?" "Always, sir. And when writing, she wore them low and let them rest open beside the pen. She disliked folding them until the business was concluded." "Of course," Alleyn said, "and the business here was hardly concluded." Fox had drawn forward a small leather book from the side table with the diffidence of a man handling a sacrament. "The call log, sir," he said. In Pritchard's clear hand, 3:30, gentleman, no name, asked for Lady Constance, declined to leave message. Alleyn noted the clean, clerkly line through the word message, as if the hand had resisted recording a void. "Rituals are repositories of truth," Alleyn observed. "When they are disturbed, we must ask who has profited by the disturbance." He considered the seed cake, still entire upon its silver stand in the drawing-room, then the empty plate at Lady Constance's place. No crumbs. She was exact in small pleasures, Mrs. Ashworth had said. Exact people did not forget their own rituals. They omitted them under pressure, or because some contrary ritual had supplanted them. "Fetch Mr. Whitmore, if you please," he said, when they returned to the library. The secretary appeared with the slightly overdone composure of a man who governs his nerves by rules. "Lady Constance's morning routine?" Alleyn inquired pleasantly. "She dealt with sensitive papers at a particular hour?" "After breakfast, Inspector. Personal correspondence first, then official matters. She never read official letters in the afternoon unless it was unavoidable." "And water?" Whitmore hesitated. "She disliked it at her desk, said it made rings on the wood." Alleyn let silence occupy the chair beside them. Outside, a hansom rattled past with a ghost of the old city in its clatter. Within, patterns assembled themselves, flower, glass, glasses, knife, each in its place or delicately out of it. He did not announce his conclusion, for he had none yet. But a sense formed, like dust discovering the surface upon which it will settle, that some hand had moved through Lady Constance's habits with intimate knowledge, altering one or two small things and trusting the household to explain them away. They opened the safe in the presence of Pritchard, whose respectful gravity might have dignified a coronation. The little iron door yielded at once to the key Alleyn had found lying like an afterthought against the Persian carpet. Within, order reigned, jewel cases aligned with military neatness, a ledger bound in dull calf. A shallow tray of envelopes, each addressed in Lady Constance's precise, slanting hand. Yet even here the world had slipped a fraction from its axis. One space on the tray showed the faint dust oval of a recently removed packet. The ledger's silk marker lay askew, not seated at its accustomed quarter-inch from the foredge. Alleyn lifted the ledger and found nothing sensational. Entries of dividends, charitable disbursements, subscriptions to a gallery trust, yet one page bore the light scar of something torn out along the inner margin. He did not comment, merely closed it and examined the envelopes. All were sealed with Lady Constance's small ivory wafer bearing the Fairweather crest, save one. This carried a wafer too large and of a different red, stamped with a borrowed device that sought to be official and succeeded only in being ceremonious. The paper was not the Foreign Office blue. It was a good stationer's imitation, faintly scented and very slightly too smooth. Pritchard, gazing without gazing, said in a level tone, "Her ladyship managed her seals herself, sir." "Quite." Alleyn set the odd envelope back in its slot as if it might startle. He regarded the empty dust oval on the tray. "Who, besides Lady Constance, had access to the safe?" "No one, sir, in the regular way," Pritchard replied. "Mr. Whitmore would be permitted if requested. Otherwise, no." They had not finished when a discreet rustle approached, and young Thomas's voice, paired of all but necessity, sounded at the door. "Beg pardon, sir. Mr. Whitmore has been taken a little queer in the study. The fire's been lit there. Uncommon early." Alleyn's eyes met Fox's. No surprise, only the faintest settling of a piece into place. "We will go at once." The study, never untidy, had assumed a conscientious neatness that proclaimed recent adjustment. Whitmore stood by the chimney-piece, colourless and composed to the point of translucence, while Dr. Hartwell, summoned by no one and by everyone, set down a stethoscope with the practical tenderness of habit. "A faintness," Whitmore said, his voice pared thin. "I have slept badly these last nights." The grate told its own unremarkable story. A nest of new coals, a little pyramid of kindling, and on the lip, the faint blue ash that expensive rag paper leaves when hurried to extinction. A tongue rested askew. The metal was still pleasantly warm. On the hearth rug lay the fragment of a red wafer, stamped into oblivion. "Autumn air does this to the most robust," Alleyn observed, as if diagnosing the city. "Forgive my curiosity. What occasioned a fire at such an hour?" Whitmore's eyes slipped toward the window. "Drafts inspector. The study faces north." Mrs. Ashworth had followed on some ancestral right to supervise crises. She paused within the threshold and sniffed, not dramatically, but with the assurance of one who had presided over household economies since the Treaty of Versailles. "Burning new paper is a little indulgent in this weather." "Quite right," murmured Dr. Hartwell, giving Whitmore a professional glance that was both permission and warning. "A glass of water, if you please." Thomas brought it. Whitmore took an obedient sip. His hands steadied at once. The room seemed to breathe again, though the ghost of scented paper lingered in the grate with delicate impudence. Alleyn lifted the tongue and, with an absent care that suggested habit rather than hope, coaxed an intact corner from beneath the ash. It bore nothing but a torn margin, and the pale impression of a watermark, no help to anyone incapable of reading empty space. He did not pocket it. He let it fall back, a concession to decorum. "Pray do not excite yourself, Mr. Whitmore," Alleyn said gently. "We shall keep the study closed for a little while, merely to satisfy a tiresome formality. Pritchard will arrange it." He turned, his grey gaze moving as if to include and exonerate everyone present. "There will be no inconvenience." When they had withdrawn, Fox said in the corridor, "Ash from blue paper, sir, and sealing wax from somewhere else." He was frightened. "Yes," said Alleyn. "But of whom?" It was late afternoon again, the hour at which Meridian House had, the day before, composed itself for tea. Somewhere above, a door closed with exaggerated softness, as if someone practiced not being heard. The house resumed its posture. The guests, like figures returned to their pedestals, took up the attitudes of patience. Yet the atmosphere had altered by a degree too fine for measurement. A second hand had moved on the clock, and no one had touched the dial. Evening installed itself at Meridian House with the tact of a courteous guest. Lamps were lit. The fire declared a discreet presence. Alleyn, who had made of quietness a working tool, allowed the hush to gather about him as he sat in the library. Fox opposite, the table between them ordered with a few plain objects, the suspicious envelope in a glassine sleeve, a page of penciled notes, a small spray of fallen chrysanthemum petals gathered from the morning-room carpet. "Nothing violent," he said after a time. "Not so much to Fox as to the atmosphere. A hand that understands ritual, not the sort to break a lock when a drawer will open of itself at the right hour." Fox, who admired understatement as some admire music, merely nodded. "The laboratory can tell us about the glass," he murmured. "If you wish, sir." "In due course," said Alleyn. "But the chemistry strikes me as almost incidental." He tapped the glassine sleeve, very lightly as though not to disturb it. "This wax is throwing its voice, too red by half and theatrical in the impression. The words on that fragment, discretionary compensation, are not the Foreign Office's music. They belong to a person who has learned official phrases as one learns a dance by watching." He allowed his mind to retrace the household steps, beginning not with the dead woman, but with the living furniture of habit. Lady Constance had made inquiries about almonds, yet did not touch the cake that had so long been her ritual. She had asked for water in the morning-room, a deviation, then sat, spectacles folded prematurely, as if invited to pause. A petal lay where it should not. A key had fallen where Lady Constance would not have dropped it had she been quite herself. Each small trespass upon order suggested not hurry, but an attentive mimicry. Someone counting on the house to explain itself. He found himself thinking of Pritchard's professional silence, Mrs. Ashworth's staunch guardianship of custom, Dr. Hartwell's scrupulous discretion, General Finch's timekeeping, Whitmore's exactitudes, and Miss Penelope's bright, anxious fielding of observation. Thornfield, with paint-scarred fingers, watched people as if composing them. Each had contributed a note to the afternoon score, and yet it was the rests, the not quite said, that formed the theme. "Telephone calls," Alleyn said, turning a pencil between finger and thumb. The private inquiry refrain, an educated voice, a garden visitor who refused his name, an envelope that looks official across a room but will not bear scrutiny in the hand. Pressure without spectacle, reputation as instrument. Fox made another of his small, respectful sounds. "Inside knowledge, sir." "Intimate knowledge," Alleyn corrected. "Of her habits, certainly. Possibly of her fears." He saw again the manner in which Whitmore had stood at the window, half clerk, half sentinel, the general's glance perpetually to the clock. Mrs. Ashworth smoothing an invisible crease from the damask as though to tidy emotion. Thornfield's grave attention trained not on objects, but on human alteration. Miss Penelope's eyes turning, when unobserved, to the door that led to the morning-room. He could imagine different forms of love and pride that might translate, under stress, into silence, how one might accept extortion rather than consult a friend who would advise publicity, how another might meddle, for her sake, in exactly the wrong way. He rose. "We shall not press them tonight." He looked to Fox. "Ask the exchange for the particulars of those calls, quietly. Let the laboratory consider the glass, quietly. And ask Pritchard to reproduce tomorrow's tea with the exactitude of today's, including the cake and the chrysanthemums. Quietly." "Very good, sir." Alleyn returned the envelope to its case, the petals to their envelope, and closed his notebook. Through the half-open door, he could hear the house adjusting itself. A coal settled. A clock confessed its minute. Somewhere a servant moved with trained softness. The dust motes in the lamplight descended like thoughts at last content to take their places. He did not, just yet, assign his conclusions words. The pattern was there, faint as watermark, only waiting for the stroke that would bring it out. The house had settled into that particular hush which follows the tidying away of shock. Lamps were lit, firelight rehearsed its old music. Alleyn, with the air of a man proposing a civility, asked Mr. Whitmore to step into the morning room. Pritchard, immaculate as ever, made himself usefully invisible at the threshold. Whitmore arrived with ledger-like composure, though his fingers would not agree on a single position. Alleyn placed the suspect envelope upon the blotter so that the theatrical wax caught the lamplight. You will notice, Mr. Whitmore, the colour and impression are not in Lady Constance's manner. She preferred the ivory seal. Whitmore considered the object as if it were a figure that would not balance. Certainly not of her ladyship's issuing, sir. Something external, importunate. His glance flicked to the open drawer where the paper knife lay. Lady Constance disliked vulgar emphasis. Indeed, Alleyn said mildly, and yet such emphasis has occurred. Calls from a private inquiry service, a visitor by the garden door, a missing packet from her private tray. You had access to the safe, on instruction. Only on instruction, Whitmore repeated a shade too quickly. Her ladyship dealt personally with all delicate matters. I merely facilitated. Compensation, Alleyn said very softly, using the word from the fragment Penelope had produced. Whitmore's eyes acknowledged it. The rest of him did not move. You were present when such an arrangement was drafted? Whitmore's courtesy held. I was present when paper was chosen and a letter set aside for later wording. Her ladyship preferred to consider her phrases. She did not dictate. Thank you. Alleyn's tone made of the dismissal a small reprieve. If you please, send Mr. Thornfield to me. Marcus Thornfield entered with that grave inwardness peculiar to artists who understand how rooms compose themselves around grief. A small fleck of vermilion clung to the stitching of his cuff, no doubt a remnant of studio work. Alleyn allowed the silence to arrange itself before speaking. You are a man who understands impressions, he said, tapping the wax. Would you call this official? Thornfield's gaze held the object with detached interest. Official by intention, not effect. The stamp is borrowed, the wax common. It has the vanity of forgery, too eager to be believed. You know the difference by practice? By temperament. He permitted the ghost of a smile. Artists and forgers share a frontier. We diverge at appetite. Lady Constance asked you yesterday for a sitting alone. Yes, she wished to reconsider a certain detail. I complied. It is not my habit to betray confidences. Nor mine, Mr. Thornfield. Alleyn lifted the envelope, replaced it. You will forgive me if I inquire of your signet. Thornfield extended a long, white hand. The ring was an antique intaglio, its device classical and quite unlike the clumsy impression on the wax. A family piece, it is rarely employed. The drawing-room had reassembled itself when Mrs. Ashworth announced without preface, Constance loathed red wax. She said it belonged to attorneys and melodrama. Her glance, sharp as a paper knife, took in Whitmore and passed to Thornfield, then softened on Penelope. She kept her tragedies in white. Dr. Hartwell, summoned with his black leather case, stood by the mantel. Alleyn's request was spare and practical. If you please, Doctor, the bottle of digitalis you prescribed and the dropper. Fox will see the laboratory work is done. I merely wish to confirm a small point of habit. The doctor produced the bottle. Its label bore his careful hand. Alleyn held the dropper to the lamplight. A faint granular drying at the stem's lip suggested recent, perhaps hasty, use. The water glass, carefully wrapped, was given to Fox, who received it as if it were a delicate opinion. No pronouncement was made. Thank you, Alleyn said. and the room took its cue to breathe. If you will indulge me further, I should like a brief look at the garden door with General Finch. Presently. Penelope, pale but steadier, drifted to the hearth. Inspector, Aunt asked me to bring down a little casket from her room this morning, then changed her mind. She bit her lip. She said, "Not yet. When one admits a thing to paper, one admits it to the world." "Wise," murmured Mrs. Ashworth. "And late." Alleyn's gaze traveled, courteous and unreadable. "Very late," he agreed. "Nevertheless, there are one or two small matters that wish to be set straight. We shall do so, I hope, quietly." Alleyn allowed a reasonable interval between confession and consequence. When he returned to the drawing room, the lamps had been shaded. Pritchard, with unfailing tact, had introduced a decanter and left it untouched. The company seemed to have resumed its positions, as if they might sustain order by preserving it. Mrs. Ashworth's hands lay folded upon her lap. General Finch stood squarely as if before a quiet parade. Mr. Whitmore's spectacles had found their precise alignment. Dr. Hartwell, grave and withdrawn, watched the fire. Marcus Thornfield had stationed himself half in shadow, his attention turned upon a patch of lamplight as though it were a sitter determined not to meet his eye. "If you will indulge me a few moments more," Alleyn said, "there are matters which, in justice to Lady Constance, require arrangement." He did not look toward the door. "Miss Fairweather has made a statement to me in private. I do not propose to inflict particulars upon you. It is enough to say that Lady Constance, in that admirable instinct which led her always to take responsibility, found herself meeting a difficulty not her own. She intended to manage it, methodically, scrupulously, and by those very virtues invited ruin." No one spoke. It had the quality of a church when the verger closes the door upon the last echo. "The household's little rituals were our tutors," he continued, her ladyship's invariability about the seed cake, her refusal to take water with correspondence, the precise order of papers and spectacles. Yesterday, these small fidelities wavered. A water-glass stood ready where she would never have placed one. A key fell where it would never have been dropped. The Foreign Office fan disturbed, then restored with memory rather than habit. A chrysanthemum plucked, not loosened. These were not extravagances. They were the language of interference. General Finch's voice, when it came, was level and almost formal. "The medicine, Inspector." "Digitalis," Dr. Hartwell answered with quiet self-indictment. "Prescribed by me in modest dose." "The dose Lady Constance received was not modest," Alleyn said without emphasis. "It was placed where, in a moment of agitation, she would take it without thought. One must know a person very closely to choose the exact deviation she will accept." Mrs. Ashworth's silver head inclined, the barest acknowledgement of an unwelcome symmetry. "We contrive our own snares, Inspector, by training our cages too well." "The telephone calls," Whitmore ventured, producing his fact like a ledger column. "They will have significance." "They do, and do not," Alleyn said. "Enough to create a weather of alarm. The blackmail existed. It was not of Lady Constance's making, but the hand that turned alarm into opportunity was very near. Lady Constance meant to pay nothing and confess nothing. She intended to insulate reputation by taking upon herself the negotiation. It was a brave, imprudent course. She was observed, beloved, and, fatally, anticipated. Thornfield stirred. If art is to blame, if my sittings... Art revealed nothing that truth had not already disclosed to those concerned, Alleyn said almost kindly. You saw only what everyone preferred not to name. He let the silence lengthen until it bore its own weight. Miss Fairweather will remain in the library. I've asked Pritchard to provide writing materials. There are letters she may wish to compose before the formalities begin. Dr. Hartwell, you will see her for the shock. No heroic measures, I think. Mr. Whitmore, you will be good enough to arrange for the family solicitor and to preserve Lady Constance's private papers exactly as they are. No adjustments, however innocent. Pritchard's assent was a shade deeper than his bow. "Certainly, sir." "Lady Constance's intentions," Alleyn said, "were in their way magnificent. She designed, as always, to protect others from the consequences of their humanity. It is an irony of very old lineage that such guardianship can turn executioner." Mrs. Ashworth rose, the movement precise, as if acknowledging a benediction. "There is very little to be done, then, beyond doing it properly." "Precisely," said Alleyn. He did not detain them. They dispersed with the quiet of those leaving a chapel after evensong, each person bearing away an allotment of understanding. In the passage, Alleyn paused to listen to the house finding its new silence. It had altered timbre, as rooms do when a portrait is removed and the wall reveals a paler shape. He turned toward the library, where a young woman sat before a blank sheet, and the ink had not yet flowed. The formalities proceeded with the quiet inevitability of household ritual. After the drawing-room disclosure, Inspector Alleyn spoke briefly with Fox in the hall. A telephone call was placed to the yard, with requests couched in the sort of courtesy that meant more than its words. "No uniforms, please." A car from Cannon Row, unmarked. The press must not be alarmed by commotion at the railings. Pritchard, without explicit instruction, contrived a small ceremony of departure. A dark traveling cloak was produced for Miss Penelope, gloves placed within its pocket, a modest hat, veiled, set upon the console as if it had always waited there for this precise purpose. The butler's face maintained its professional impassivity, yet his hands moved with the measured compassion of one who had dressed a bride and an invalid with equal care, and knew that both ceremonies called for gentleness. Mrs. Ashworth rose, a little stiffly, and crossed to Penelope. "You will require a reliable solicitor," she announced, not unkindly. "Whitmore will arrange it. We shall speak no more of this child, until it can be spoken of without hysteria." The old lady's fingers, surprisingly warm, closed briefly over the girl's wrist, then withdrew as if returning something borrowed. General Finch offered the name of a barrister with the crisp authority of a man used to cutting through fog. Dr. Hartwell produced, from an inner pocket, a neat memorandum of the digitalis schedule he had prescribed. "I should not like its lack to be construed as complicity," he said, anguish suppressed beneath professional phrasing. Alleyn inclined his head. "Your statement will be received as intended, Doctor." Marcus Thornfield stood a little apart, his hands, still faintly stained, loosely folded. "The portrait?" he asked at last, in a voice less concerned for property than for the proprieties of truth. Alleyn's gaze moved to him, thoughtful. "Leave the canvas covered, Mr. Thornfield. Some truths require stillness before they can be looked at." Penelope rose when Fox returned to say that the car waited. She had aged an indefinite number of years in the last hour, not so much altered in feature as refined by suffering into something simultaneously harder and more transparent. Pritchard held the cloak while she slipped into it with the natural economy of movement that marks those accustomed to being helped without being made helpless. She made a small, abortive gesture toward the mantelpiece, toward the chrysanthemums perhaps, or the clock, and then let her hand fall. No handcuffs were produced, no voice was raised. The household arranged itself unconsciously to create a discreet path to the door. Whitmore, pale but efficient, stepped forward with a card upon which a name had been written in his careful hand. "The family firm, Miss Penelope. They will meet you at the station." She looked at him with an expression Alleyn could not read, and nodded once. The front door closed with the soft certainty of excellent carpentry. After a moment, the usual sounds of the house resumed their delicate commerce with silence. The faint settling of the fire, a distant clink in the pantry, the almost inaudible return of traffic beyond the railings. Mrs. Ashworth sank back, her composure intact, her eyes bright with an anger too cold for display. "Constance would have despised melodrama," she observed, as if delivering judgment upon the day's most grievous temptation. She has been spared it. General Finch examined his watch and, discovering time unchanged by tragedy, put it away as if ashamed. Dr. Hartwell stared into the fire. The flames, having nothing more to consume, busied themselves with arrangement. Pritchard approached the tea table, lifted the silver stand, and at last removed the untouched seed cake. Ritual conceded, but not surrendered. Alleyn remained a moment longer in the morning room before he, too, departed. The water glass had been taken for analysis. The scattered papers had resumed their diplomatic composure. On the carpet lay a single chrysanthemum petal he had somehow missed. He bent, lifted it between finger and thumb, and set it on the blotter where it looked, absurdly, like an initial. He stood very still, listening to the faint breath of the house, and let the quiet arrive. The following morning arrived with a pale, impartial light that seemed to wash Meridian House of color and drama. Inspector Alleyn, having completed the documents that civilization demanded, took a cab south toward Chelsea. The address belonged to Marcus Thornfield, a top-floor studio ordered under its disarray, smelling faintly of oil of spike lavender, resin, and the cool dust of north light. Thornfield received him without surprise. He wore his melancholy like a well-cut coat, and his hands, stained faintly with verdigris and bone-black, were very still. On a table lay an assortment of objects that made their own quiet statement. A stick of sealing wax of an unusually deep red, a small hand press with a clumsy intaglio cut into its face, and a packet of heavy cream paper not generally found in stationers who supplied private households. "You will have traced the telephone calls," Thornfield said, as if completing a sketch already begun. His voice held neither belligerence nor appeal. "To a tobacconist's kiosk off Sloane Square," Alleyn admitted. The messages were simple, almost formulaic. A private inquiry service is a useful conceit when one wishes to sound official without being so. He lifted the seal press delicately. This, too large by half, and the red not the Foreign Office's dull wax, but a theatrical shade that flatters under gaslight. A shadow of amusement touched Thornfield's mouth and was gone. "I carved the stamp from a chessman," he said, "an ivory bishop. One does what one can when the world declines to pay for canvases. The letter you left bore a scent not easily confused," Alleyn continued, allowing courtesy to carry the weight of accusation. "Oil of spike lavender from your mediums. The envelope's weight matched this stock, and the lac used here leaves that particular granular residue. Lady Constance, who understood appearances more intimately than truth, would have recognized a threat in official costume." Thornfield walked to the window and looked down upon the thin river of traffic. "I wanted money," he said simply. "Debts. A dealer whose patience had turned evangelical. I had no wish to ruin her. I intended to alarm her into a discreet settlement. I did not anticipate this." "No," Alleyn agreed, with that grave calm that softened judgments without averting them. "You did not anticipate the logic of a world in which appearances rule. You pressed upon a woman whose remedy was procedure, whose method was record, whose love, when tested, would move her to take everything upon herself." "And Penelope," Thornfield said, still without turning. "In saving her name, she killed for it." "The Yard will deal with your part," Alleyn said. "It is not murder. It is a sordid trade with elegant manners. If you are wise, you will arrange your affairs before my colleagues develop a talent for impromptu visits." Thornfield inclined his head. "I have always been better with exits than entrances." When Alleyn returned to Meridian House, the air seemed clearer, as if the house had inhaled the morning and decided to survive it. Pritchard, grave and immaculate, oversaw the restoration of small rituals. A fresh bowl of chrysanthemum stood upon the console, faultless, almost severe in their whiteness. Mrs. Ashworth had come early. She sat in the morning room with an upright patience that did not require comfort. "Well?" she asked, as if the question were elemental. It was not an inquiry agency, Alleyn said. An artist's device in official clothing. He will be dealt with, quietly. She inclined her head, the gesture both acknowledgement and benediction. We breed our tyrannies, Inspector. Those who worship appearances are faithful unto death. He did not contradict her. The escritoire had been cleared, the water glass removed, the paper knife returned to its drawer. On the carpet, nearly invisible against the Persian pattern, lay a single petal, missed by even Pritchard's perfect attentions. Alleyn bent, lifted it, and placed it upon the blotter where Lady Constance had arranged her last papers. Fox appeared in the doorway, solid as furniture. "Tea, sir?" "In a moment," Alleyn said. The house was quiet in the manner of places where grief has been translated into routine. Beyond the tall windows, London continued its patient murmur, indifferent, inexhaustible. Alleyn looked once more at the petal upon the leather, light, deliberate, the smallest sign of a life ruled by ceremony, and felt, as he often did at the end of such affairs, that justice in such houses was less a verdict than a tidying of the scene. Outside, a cab passed, its wheels whispering on the wet. Inside, the flower held its place, a white comma at the end of an unwritten sentence.